Vietnam 1966. Yesterday on August 17th, the enemy sent mortar and recoilless rifle teams within attack range of about 2 kilometers from your base. The surprise bombing that has lasted throughout the night has killed at least one soldier and wounded several others. Thankfully, further enemy attacks are halted by the rapid counterfire from the base's guns into the jungle brush. The next morning, the commander of the base orders Delta Company to locate the enemy and their firing positions and clear the area. Instead, they will fight an intense battle over the next 24 hours against a vastly larger number of the Viet Cong. This is the story of the ambush at Long Tang. Australia was one of the few countries that contributed to the United States in the Vietnam War effort from 1962 to 1971. But due to diplomatic considerations, the Australian government wanted to restrict their forces to southern coastal areas and prevent deployment anywhere near international borders. The overall command of forces in Vietnam was under the American General Westmoreland, who agreed with the Australian request and was eager to make good use of the Australian troops in the area east of Saigon, a mostly Viet Cong-controlled farming province called Phuoc Tuy. The first complete Australian Army unit deployed to Vietnam was the 1st Battalion Royal Australian Regiment, or 1st RAR, in April 1965. This unit was initially sent to Bien Hoa outside of Saigon, joining the American 173rd Airborne Brigade. The following month, the Australian unit received a battery of 155mm guns, augmenting the other battery of 105mm from New Zealand, and a squadron of M113 armored personnel carriers. The following year, in March of 1966, the 1st RAR returned home, replaced instead by the 5th RAR and the 6th RAR, which came a month after. These combined units were then designated the 1st Australian Task Force, or ATF, which would start operating independently. The ATF was then sent to Vung Tau in May 1966. Let's take a look at the local area of operations for some context. The province of Phuoc Tuy was mostly a rural area made up of farm fields and scrublands, though there is also some jungle areas. Most of the 100,000 inhabitants of this province lived along the coastline areas and were known to be pro-Viet Cong or at least neutral, making the task of pacification more challenging and dangerous for the Australian forces. To the northeast of Vung Tau, in the Mai Tau Hills, the Viet Cong's 5th Division was deployed, while a smaller detachment, the locally raised guerrilla D445 VC Battalion, was known to be spread out within the various local villages. The ATF commander, Brigadier O.D. Jackson, decided to set up a forward base of operations at a small hill known as Nui Dat, 20 miles north of the base at Vung Tau. Here he placed his 105mm artillery along with a unit of American-made 155mm guns, which could cover a wider area. And so on May 24th, the 5th RAR joined the American 173rd Airborne Brigade to secure Nui Dat Hill and surrounding areas from the Viet Cong. 3 weeks later, the 6th RAR would be joining the other Aussie units, allowing the Americans to pull out the 173rd Airborne Brigade to be redeployed elsewhere. The Australian soldiers were now on their own to control and pacify the entire province. The Australians deployed their Special Air Service, or SAS units, to push deep into the province in search and destroy missions, often ambushing the Viet Cong troop movements using claymore mines and machine guns. The 5th RAR and the 6th RAR were ordered to clear a buffer zone around the Nui Dat Hill base to keep the Viet Cong beyond mortar range. Villages in the area, including Long Tan, were searched and their inhabitants relocated to other areas in order to maintain security in the sector around the base. However, on August 17, 1966, the Viet Cong was able to bring mortar teams within range of the base and caught the Australians by surprise with a barrage of fire, killing 1 Aussie soldier and wounding 23 others. The Australian commander then ordered the 5th RAR and A Company of the 6th RAR on a search and destroy mission of the enemy mortar teams. Brigadier Jackson then sent out the understrength Bravo Company 6th RAR to sweep the area east of the base. Finding no enemy, the Australian units were ordered to return to base by the following day, when Delta Company 6th RAR would then take over the patrols. Unknown to the Australians, the Viet Cong had amassed 7 battalions of over 4,000 men in total strength and were closing in on the Nui Dat base. 3 battalions would swing towards the north to flank the base, while the other 4 battalions would advance from the east using the Longtang rubber plantation as cover. The following day, August 18, 1966, Delta Company of the 6th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, commanded by Major Harry Smith, prepared to set out to locate the enemy mortar positions they had fired on their base, as well as to track the enemy routes of retreat and push the enemy back beyond mortar range. Delta Company was made up of 108 men split into 3 platoons, the 10th, 11th, and 12th, with a small HQ detachment. At 1100 hours on August 18th, they left the Nui Dat base with 2nd Lieutenant David Sabin's 12th Platoon on point. 2 hours later, Delta Company linked up with Bravo Company just west of the rubber plantation. The 6th RAR continued east into the plantation itself, where the trail then splits to the north and east into the evenly spaced rubber trees. 2nd Lieutenant Jeff Kendall's 10th Platoon takes the northern trail route, while 2nd Lieutenant Gordon Sharp's 11th Platoon moves east into the rubber tree area. The 12th Platoon and the HQ detachment follow closely behind Sharp's 11th Platoon. 40 minutes later, the leading 11th Platoon encounters a half a dozen Viet Cong soldiers and fires upon them. Some of the VCs escape east into the wall of dense jungle. As the 11th Platoon enters the jungle in pursuit of the enemy, the area erupts in an intense hail of fire from the hidden Viet Cong soldiers, killing 2 Australians instantly and sending the rest of the platoon to seek whatever cover they can find. The Viet Cong battalion's attack intensifies as the enemy forces attempt to encircle the trapped 11th Platoon. Farther behind, the 12th Platoon and the HQ detachment are attacked with mortar fire and cannot advance to rescue the 11th Platoon. The well-trained and disciplined Australians recover from the initial shock of the ambush and begin to return effective fire, picking off enemy soldiers while remaining in cover. Captain Maurice Stanley, a forward observer with the HQ detachment, begins to call in artillery strikes, and soon the shells of all 24 of the Aussies' 105mm guns are exploding all around the Viet Cong's positions. The Americans' 155mm guns also join in and pulverize the whole area of the rubber plantation. Within minutes, as the 10th Platoon is making its way south along the trail to reinforce the beleaguered troops of the 11th and 12th platoons, the weather turns bad with torrential rains, and visibility is then reduced to less than 50 yards. Meanwhile, back at the base at Nui Dat, Lieutenant Colonel Colin Townsend, commanding the 6th RAR, decides to send out a relief force consisting of Alpha Company 6th RAR on board the M113 armored personnel carriers. Leaves the base compound at 17:45 hours. At the rubber plantation, Delta Company is putting up a good fight, but they are beginning to run low on ammunition. Sections of the 11th Platoon pull back towards the HQ group in the west and set up a defensive perimeter while the wounded are tended to. The artillery barrage suddenly ceases to allow 2 Australian UH-1 helicopters from Nui Dat to bring in much-needed supplies. At that point, the Viet Cong begins a human wave attack on the Australian defending force, which is stopped in time when the artillery barrage starts again, breaking off the enemy assault. The Viet Cong, determined to destroy the Australians, sends the D445 battalion around to the west to complete the encirclement. At that moment, Robert's M113 armored personnel carriers cross the Sui Da Bang River and completely surprises the VC battalion. The M113s fire their 50 caliber machine guns at near point-blank range, and some M113s even run over other VC soldiers trying to escape. The M113s have arrived at the Australian defensive perimeter at 1840 hours and begin to push back the enemy with intense fire. A few minutes later, Bravo Company 6 RAR, which has moved east from Nui Dat on foot, arrive and provides additional reinforcements. With this now larger force, the Australians begin to pull back west while additional supplies are brought in from the base. The following morning, on August 19, 1966, Townsend orders Delta Company 6 RAR to reoccupy the battlefield. Amazingly, they are able to find 2 wounded Australians while recovering the bodies of their fallen brothers. They also collect the enemy dead and bury them. The Australians have lost 17 men killed, while they have counted 245 enemies dead. This has actually turned into a victory for the Australians, who have crushed the attackers through their superior firepower of the artillery batteries, the M113 armored personnel carriers, and the well-trained infantry soldiers. The Australians have managed to push the VC 5th Division back into the Mai Tao Hills while extending control of more territory in the province. Darkness, chaos, heartbeats pound. You're young and thousands of kilometers from home. You're an Australian in Vietnam, fresh from the initial onslaught of the Tet Offensive. The worst seems behind you. But just as the fragile calm settles, your commanders tap your unit for a dangerous new mission. They say it's routine, a mere supporting action for the American units in the area. They say the enemy's finished, but they are dead wrong. A few short hours after your arrival deep into enemy territory, the sun drops behind the jungle canopy and shadows begin to move around the perimeter. Suddenly, someone shouts, guns blaze in the pitch black. The next instant, rocket-propelled grenades tear into your camp. Mortar explosions, screams, and the whole night erupts, and hundreds of North Vietnamese soldiers are swarming towards your position. Fire Support Base Coral. The fight for survival and for the fate of your mates is about to begin as trouble brews north of Saigon. The 1 ATF, battle-tested yet weary, moves in to block the enemy's retreat and disrupt new offensives. Orders are muddled, helicopters arrive late, landing zones become a chaotic mess. And nobody realizes just how close the NVA is to overwhelming your brand new, safe base. One artillery officer will later say it flatly. It was chaos disguised as a plan. As night falls, the Australians make a checklist, and it's not reassuring. Positions are barely fortified, mortars are just unloaded, D Company is still outside, laying ambushes. They'll beef things up tomorrow. It's 02:15 hours, and an Australian sentry catches movement. Then, the jungle explodes into violence. RPGs smash into the perimeter, instantly killing one and wounding 11. Suddenly, you're fighting for your life and your Aussies mates. Hundreds of North Vietnamese are pouring in, mortars and machine guns are blazing. Aussie mortar crews are nearly overrun, and gunners are forced into brutal hand-to-hand combat. One artillery crew, out of options, turns their 105mm howitzers into a deadly mega shotgun, firing flechette-loaded Splintex rounds over open sights and over friendly soldiers. Shards rip the enemy to shreds just mere meters away. The North Vietnamese push through the wire at number 6 pit. Desperate, an Aussie officer empties his pistol point blank at the enemy, grabs a machine gun, and races to join the fight. High above, an American spooky gunship arrives, letting loose its miniguns. Streaks of light rip into the darkness as artillery from nearby support bases hammer the jungle all around. Before dawn, the surviving enemy drag their dead into the trees. The toll for this night, 9 Australians killed. Over 50 enemy bodies lie inside the perimeter, with estimates of over 100 enemy casualties dragged away by the unseen NVA. Just days later, the North Vietnamese return, harder, angrier. Mortars and RPGs punish the base, followed by wave after wave of assault. This time, an estimated 2 full NVA battalions hit A and D companies in mounting waves. But again, Aussie gunners fire their flechettes over open sights, cutting down swaths of rushing enemy soldiers. And again, superior air power and artillery save the day. Australian troops suffer more casualties, 5 fallen Aussie soldiers. Enemy troops are cut down by the Aussies' superior firepower. Dozens lay scattered outside the wire. This time, the enemy doesn't even try to drag them away. Those witnessing the carnage say the battlefield reeks of blood and cordite. For some, it's the only time in Vietnam that they see bulldozers used to bury the dead. Relief finally thunders in. Centurion tanks of the 1st Armored Regiment. Aussie troops cheer as the armor rolls into Coral. They're grinning ear to ear, one digger recalls, absolutely thrilled to be there. Tanks now join infantry in attacks on enemy bunker complexes. Canister rounds slice through the jungle and bunkers with terrifying force. Enemy soldiers have nowhere to run. One tank crewman watches his shells tear through enemy cover like a buzzsaw. Not far from FSB Coral, it's now Fire Support Base Balmoral's turn. Mortar and RPG barrages rain down, but this typical enemy tactic gives the Australians time and valuable intel on direction and size of the attack. Tanks and APCs are ready and quickly counterattack as spooky gunships scream overhead, unleashing their firepower against the enemy below. Despite the enemy's desperate and mostly unorganized rushes, the Australians hold the line. Afterwards, 42 NVA soldiers are counted, many more likely to have been dragged away. 2 days later, and just before dawn, mortar shells fall again. Enemy troops storm the wire at Balmoral. The Aussies are again ready for them. In the chaos, an Australian pinned under a tank leaps into the turret, unleashing its .30 caliber machine gun, and cuts down the enemy right in their tracks. More gunships arrive with their deadly aerial cannons blasting the enemy, and Centurion tanks shatter the enemy formations. Desperate, some retreating NVA troops dive into B-52 craters for cover, only to be hunted down by Aussie helicopter gunships. There is no escape. Sunrise reveals a grim scene, fields littered with the enemy dead, many very young. One RAR patrols stumble upon a hidden bunker complex. It is now the hunted to become the hunter. Under heavy fire, 2 Centurion tanks race to the rescue. Again, helicopter gunships arrive and circle above. Artillery shells crash down on the enemy with ruthless precision. It takes hours to fight free, but they make it. Only 1 Australian is killed. 7 are wounded. But the enemy loses far more. The bunker complex is also shattered, and this time the enemy's forward secret base will no longer threaten Saigon's exposed flanks. Overall, the Aussies have proven themselves in the most brutal fight of their entire Vietnam War experience. The operation to block further supplies and enemy troops from hitting Saigon is a tactical and strategic success and is part of the overall continuing phases to fight the Tet Offensive. There is, however, a human cost to all of this. Over 3 weeks of relentless combat have left 26 Australians killed and nearly 100 wounded. Lives forever changed. The North Vietnamese have also suffered over 270 officially counted dead. In the battles of Coral and Balmoral, mass attacks, close quarter combats, and bunker brawls, the Australians faced it all and held the line with grit and raw courage. For their bravery, the Royal Australian Regiment, 1st Armoured Regiment, and 3rd Cavalry Regiment receive the battle honor Coral-Balmoral. In 2008, 102 Battery Royal Australian Artillery is awarded the honor title Coral, finally honoring the gunners who stood their ground when hope seemed gone. In the summer of 1969, the Australian 6 RAR was engaged with the NVA 33rd Regiment, about 10 to 12 kilometers north of Binh Ba. They had requested a tank recovery vehicle, which had left the Nui Dat base on the morning of 6 June 1969, escorted by 1 Centurion tank. Although the route north from the base was considered relatively safe, there was still the possibility of enemy activity. At about 0800 hours on the 6th of June, as the tank and the recovery vehicle were in the area of the village of Binh Ba, the Centurion tank was hit by an enemy RPG round, wounding the turret operator. The Australian crews immediately engaged with machine gun fire from both vehicles before they left the scene and called the base for reinforcements. After the Centurion tank was hit, 2 regional force platoons were sent to investigate, but were stopped by heavy fire from the village. The district chief requested support from provincial headquarters in Baria, which in turn requested assistance from the more lethal Australian Army forces. Less than an hour later, Major Murray Blake attended a briefing at the task force headquarters. Blake was the officer commanding the task force's Ready Reaction Force D Company, 5 RAR. At about 1000 hours, Blake's company left Nui Dat in armored personnel carriers, or APCs, commanded by Captain Ray DeVere of B Squadron, 3 Cavalry Regiment. With them was a composite group of tanks from B Squadron, 1st Armored Regiment, under the command of 2nd Lieutenant Brian Sullivan. While the Australians traveled the short distance between Nui Dat and Binh Ba, the local district chief tried to evacuate the civilian population. He also deployed his own troops, members of the regional force, into blocking positions to cut off the enemy's escape. Half an hour after leaving Nui Dat, Blake's force deployed about 300 meters to the southeast of Binh Ba and awaited clearance to move in. Sergeant Brian London, 10 Platoon's acting commander, remembered pulling up on open ground before the village. Seconds later, RPG smoke trails headed towards him. Instinct demanded that he exit the APC. A hit from the RPG could have killed or wounded everyone on board, but he fought the urge and stayed. The armored vehicles were just outside effective RPG range, and their crews were already returning fire. The Battle of Binh Ba was underway. Blake, DeVere, and Sullivan decided on an armored assault, believing that the dismounted infantry would be too vulnerable to enemy fire. DeVere, the senior armored officer, took command during this phase of the operation. Approaching from the east, the Australians advanced with tanks in the center of the formation and the APCs on either side and to the rear. 2 tanks left in pursuit of enemy troops moving through the nearby rubber plantation, as reported by the pilot of an observation plane. One of the tanks was hit by 2 RPG rounds, wounding 3 of the crew. The gunner, unable to traverse his turret, kept up a steady fire against the enemy whenever they crossed his line of sight. Still believing that they were facing just 2 Viet Cong platoons, the rest of the Australians continued into the middle of Binh Ba, now with just 2 tanks in support. In the village center, the Australians came under a storm of fire. Murray Blake remembered seeing enemy everywhere, among them a heavy machine gun crew wheeling their weapon into position before they were killed by fire from DeVere's APC. This was no pair of Viet Cong platoons. The Australians had come up against NVA troops, a far stronger force than they had expected to meet. The tanks, meanwhile, were running low on ammunition. The Australians needed to extricate themselves from the village. Overhead, a helicopter gunship had arrived on the scene and fired rockets into the enemy-occupied houses. From above, the pilots could see tanks and APCs firing into the buildings, while enemy troops ran between buildings. 2 more Hueys were called in, and guided by DeVere's directions, began to attack positions on Binh Ba's southern side. Coming in low over the tanks, they fired their rockets and miniguns into the enemy, clearing the way for the armored units and the infantry of D Company to make their way out. By now, every tank had sustained some damage by enemy fire. One was so severely damaged that it was useless for further action. Sullivan, like the others, had been so heavily engaged that his tank left Binh Ba with its last round loaded. The decision was made to get the tanks out of the village to regroup. Once the tanks were safely on open ground away from the village, 9th Squadron RAAF helicopters flew in replacement crewmen, evacuated the wounded, including Sullivan, and delivered fresh ammunition. The battle was far from over. D Company, having broken out of the village, lined up for a second assault, this time from the west and supported by fresh tanks from 4th Troop B Squadron. As 1200 hours approached, B Company 5 RAR was dispatched to help D Company, at which point Lieutenant Colonel Khan took command of Operation Hammer, relieving 6 RAR's Lieutenant Colonel David Butler. When they reached Binh Ba, B Company established blocking positions to the south and watched as flames rose from the buildings, marking the most intense combat scene. They then moved through the rubber plantation to block the east. Supported by the APCs and tanks, the dismounted assault force, now back under Blake's command, divided into house-clearing teams of 2 to 3 men and advanced on the village. Fire from the first row of buildings in the village hit Private Wayne Teeling in the neck. Teeling was a reinforcement who had been flown in that morning. Nothing more could be done for the 21-year-old who was killed in his first action. Climbing up to the hatch of a nearby tank, Brian London had the crew commander fire a high-explosive round into the building from which the fatal shot had come. Inside the ruins, the Australians found the bodies of 6 enemy soldiers. By the evening of 6 June, the fighting had died down. An exhausted D Company and Armored Corps personnel took up a defensive position for the night. Binh Ba, however, was still not secure. All was quiet until about 0320 hours on 7 June when an Australian platoon killed 2 enemy troops as they tried to escape to the south. At 0700 hours, a company of MVA soldiers was seen heading towards Binh Ba. The Australians' B Company immediately opened with heavy fire, forcing the enemy to scatter and flee. When the Australians swept the area, they found an enemy body and several blood trails, indicating that at least 6 more enemies had been wounded. An hour later, a section of APCs traveling north towards Duc Trong came under RPG fire, and a large group of enemy troops were seen moving between houses. The 5 RAR Assault Pioneer Platoon, although readied for action, were not needed in the hamlet and moved to form a blocking force into Binh Ba's northeast. Local regional troops were then sent to Duc Trong and found the NVA had gone. Just before 1000 hours, the Australians' D Company, along with the tanks and APCs, lined up for another sweep of Binh Ba. They had to ensure that no NVA or Viet Cong had infiltrated the village during the night. By 1200 hours, the western half of the village was clear, and the search was then handed over to the Popular Force troops, who swept the eastern half of the village. A few hours later, the men who had fought the battle returned to Nui Dat. Casualty figures vary, but it seems that more than 100 VC and NVA lost their lives in this battle. Several South Vietnamese soldiers were also killed in the fighting. The Australians lost only 1 soldier, Private Teeling. The Australian forces would continue to dominate the area from their Nui Dat base, conducting many more operations throughout the rest of the war. The Battle of Binh Ba was just one more example of the bravery of the Australian forces and the decisive leadership that they had. The Australians withdrew all their combat forces from Vietnam in late 1971, having suffered 423 men killed and 2,398 wounded. After they left the Phu Toi province, the South Vietnamese Army ARVN were unable to maintain control, and the VC eventually would take over the villages and territories that had been held for so long by the Australians. If you enjoyed watching this episode, go ahead and hit the like button and leave a comment. And if you haven't done so already, subscribe to the channel. That way you get notifications of the next videos.